Dr. Moranville, just enlighten us a little bit more about just a little bit about yourself and what Moranville Enterprise is.
Absolutely. And we're going to venture with vision tonight. You ready to venture with vision? Oh, all right. Moranville Enterprises is the Venture Creation Corporation, and I have the good fortune of being the chairman of Moranville Enterprises. We scale up the strategic IQ of unicorn-bound ventures. Do you know what a unicorn venture is?
No.
So a unicorn venture is one that has $1 billion valuation. So look, your venture right now, is it worth $1 billion?
No.
Okay, it may not be worth $1 billion yet. But that is the goal, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So that's why we call them unicorn-bound ventures. Now, I work with startup companies as well as ventures that are a little bit past the stage of startup. Typically, when working with very early stage startups, I'm working with a founder who has an idea, maybe really hasn't taken any action on that idea yet, but trying to figure out how to take action. And consequently, I work with those founders as a coach. Then with those companies that are in fact companies that are past the idea stage and are scaling up or preparing to scale up, I work with those founders and those ventures as a consultant. So Moranville Enterprises does indeed scale up the strategic IQ of those unicorn-bound ventures. I, along the way, had earned a PhD in business administration, which gives me a little bit of a skill set in that area of strategic management. And that's why I focus on working with ventures, startup ventures, in the area of strategic management and business development.
I really would like to know what Moranville Enterprises looked like before, you know, right at the beginning.
Yeah, right before it was Moranville Enterprises.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Let me go back into the ancient history, right? I had finished with, I'm even going to go back further than ancient history, prehistoric. I was born in a little town in Illinois called Galesburg. And when I was born, I had sight, right? I was able to see seemingly like any other individual could see. But when I turned 7, I was in the 2nd grade, I started losing my sight. It wasn't because of an accident, it was because of my DNA. You know, I just had the DNA that was going to cause that sight to go away. So within that first year, 7 years old, I had lost 90% of my sight. And, I started to become an entrepreneur then, or at least have the mindset of an entrepreneur, because an entrepreneur needs to really have that mindset of grit and tenacity, and just working your way through problems. As you can imagine, losing your eyesight at that age, there are a lot of problems that you're going to come up against. But I worked my way through those. So when I finished high school, I moved to Utah to go to college. And as an undergraduate student, okay, get this, as an undergraduate student, I studied fine arts. I'm blind. But remember, there are a lot of tactile arts, all right, like for example, ceramics. And when I was the undergraduate student studying fine arts, I lived at the dormitories, And there were a group of guys on my floor who were business students. And we would all meet together at dinner time, and they would talk about the projects that they were working on and the way that they were learning in their business classes. And it was so different from the kind of thing that I was studying, right? And the methods that they were using were so different. For example, case studies. I loved to hear about the case studies. I think that I was more interested in what they were learning than they were. So when I finished with my undergraduate degree, I decided that what I needed to do was to study business. So I got a master's degree in business administration. The thing about the MBA program that interested me the most was the final course that I took on strategic management. At that time, they called it business policy, but today they call it strategic management. And the reason being is because it looked at the whole organization. It didn't just look at marketing or finance, any particular one silo of an organization. It looked at the entire organization. And so that caught my attention, and when I graduated with my MBA, there were two things that I knew about myself for sure. And there were a lot of things that I certainly did not know about myself. Frankly, there are a lot of things that I still don't know about myself. But what I did know at that time was that I loved the process of learning. I particularly loved the process of learning business. And the second thing is that I was totally driven by the competitive nature of business. I did not want to take the typical MBA route. I wanted to create something. So I started Moranville Enterprises, and I started it as a consulting practice. And I will acknowledge to you that the businesses that I was working with at that time, and this was now 33 years ago, 1986, those businesses were not entrepreneurial. They were small businesses. The difference being that entrepreneurial businesses are intended to grow and to scale. The small business, it was there to produce a profit for its owners. But you know, those businesses, in spite of being small, they still needed to compete with the big guys. They needed to know how to hire the right people, train the right people, and they needed to get the word out through marketing to their customers. I could do those things. I could help them with that. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I assessed the situation. And I came to a positive conclusion that there was indeed opportunity for Moranville Enterprises to grow. But in order for it to grow, there were a couple of changes that were going to need to take place. One, I absolutely needed to start working with entrepreneurs who were scaling. If I was going to scale my business, I had to be working with entrepreneurs that were scaling.
Dr. Moranville, was it hard to convince any of these entrepreneurs to adopt your theory and
to work with me?
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Yes, it was hard. That was the hardest part of the whole process. You know, I tell every entrepreneur that they are fundamentally a salesperson. And, you know, and I didn't really think of myself at that time as a salesperson. I thought of myself as someone who had knowledge that I wanted to share with these entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
But I didn't think that that was sales. But 33 years later, I have a completely different attitude. Every entrepreneur is at his or her core a salesperson. You've got to have that skill of selling because you're selling to the clients that you're trying to attract. You're selling to the employees that are going to work with you. You're selling to investors that you want to put money into that business. Sales is what your business is entirely about. And yeah, that was the most difficult part.
Did you also find it difficult to find funding for any of the ventures you were working with? Or
when I was initially working, because they were small businesses, the funding wasn't so difficult. Because basically they would be getting bank loans, or they would be getting money from what we call friends, family, and fools. So that wasn't so difficult. When working with companies, though, that are scaling, it does become a lot more difficult. Part of the problem is that when you're scaling, or prior to scaling, you're still trying to really figure out what your business model is.
Sure.
Investors are concerned about investing in a business that doesn't really yet know what its business model is. Another reason is that investors are ultimately looking for traction. They want to see sales. And if a company is struggling to produce sales, investors are reluctant to invest in them.
So how much did these unicorn-bound ventures have to be making for you to work with them?
So this is a really good question that you're asking, that I want to put into even a broader context. Because there are three kinds of ventures that I deal with. So here's how I'll say it. That I grow fledgling ventures into gazelles, and then I transform gazelles into unicorns. Right? So a fledgling is a small startup that's trying to figure out exactly what its business model is and how they're going to get some traction. A gazelle is a fast-running animal. So this gazelle venture is one that is growing rapidly in terms of revenue. They may not have any profits, but they have a lot of revenue that's coming in.
Yeah.
What we want to do is to get that revenue harnessed and focused so that we can scale it. And that's where we become a unicorn.
Did these entrepreneurs that were the gazelles, did they have certain characteristics that, other entrepreneurs didn't have?
Yeah, in fact, I'll tell you, there is one characteristic that, while there are lots of characteristics that entrepreneurs have.
Yeah.
And basically, if you just look through the dictionary and you find every positive adjective, right, that's a descriptor for an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
But there is one characteristic that I find that distinguishes those that are going to be successful from those that are going to be wantrepreneurs, right?
Okay.
Those that think about it but never really become. And that is that the successful ones, the real entrepreneurs, they are learners. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not trying to say that successful entrepreneurs have gone to school and gotten all of the degrees that they could and never got a grade below an A. Right? What I'm saying is that they are learners. Whether school smart or street smart, successful entrepreneurs are learners, which means they are adaptable. They're able to do three things. The 3 C's. They're able to think critically, think creatively, and communicate what they're thinking. So it's not like, in order to become a successful entrepreneur, that you need to go to college and get a business degree. You could come from any field in a university.
So both street smarts and book smarts have that same characteristic of just wanting to learn, or?
It's true.
Okay.
They do it differently, but they both have that core desire to learn and to adapt. And I'll expand it a little bit further, that those organizations, right, those ventures that learn, right, not just the entrepreneur, not just the founder, but the venture, the organization, those ventures that learn faster and more than their competitors, they are the ones that gain and sustain competitive advantage. So the real job of a founder is to create a learning organization. And
So I
And
kind
that's
of
what
want
I-
to bring up the Forbes article you contributed
Yeah.
to. You talk about the Swiss Army knife. Can you talk a bit about that?
yeah, absolutely. You know, so I wrote this article because I saw a number of companies that I was consulting with, ventures that, you know, they had founders that were experiencing the founder's dilemma. You know, which is basically that they have so much on their plate and they need to be doing what's strategic. Not the things that are all of the little operational parts, but they're kind of forced into doing all those little operational parts.
Yeah.
Because they're oftentimes the only person.
Yeah, funding, or you know, maybe there's no one else that wants to
Right,
join the venture.
exactly. So what I'm proposing in this article, and I don't use these words in the article, but you'll understand what I mean, that you know, that founder is Batman. Batman needs a Robin. Right, he needs to have that person who is effectively a chief operating officer. The person who is a Swiss Army knife. So you would know that a Swiss Army knife is a knife that has all kinds of different utility blades and screw corks, and I mean, there are all kinds of things in a Swiss Army knife. Well, that's what a Swiss Army knife person is like. You want to have someone as a founder, you want to have someone who has enough understanding, not necessarily an expert, but enough understanding to take care of the operational needs that you have so that you can focus on the strategic needs of the organization. In fact, I think probably we all, you know, as founders, we all need a Swiss Army knife.
Yeah. When should a founder make that decision, like early on in the venture, or how long do you usually recommend for someone to wait and or start looking for someone?
I think as soon as that venture starts to show that it has the potential for traction, as soon as you start as a founder getting so many things on your plate that you're not able to really give your attention to the one thing that's important, the strategic issues, that's when you need to, you know, to have the Swiss Army knife. So in fact, do you wait until that point to start looking for the Swiss Army knife? I say no. You should be looking for the Swiss Army knife very early on and bringing them on when you find that need.
What does the framework look for? Like, the framework that you set up for these entrepreneurs and ventures early on when they're making traction, like what does that look like?
So, as I said, I start with founders when they just even have a concept. I coach with them. Lots of times what I find is at that early stage, the thing that they're struggling with is confidence and courage. You know, the confidence that they can really start a business, and then the courage to take the action, right? Confidence being mindset, courage being action. Once we get them off of, you know, that fear of taking action, and they are now taking action, we have a venture that has the ability to start to make sales. Now we transition into consulting. And I have a framework that I mentioned just a little bit ago, as I was talking about learning. Yeah. When I was working on my PhD, there was a theory that I found as I was doing research. It was called organizational learning theory. And that theory basically says that those organizations that learn more and faster than their competitors are the ones that will gain and sustain competitive advantage. That theory made a lot of sense to me. And while that was not a theory that was getting a lot of research attention, because a lot of research that's done in academia is basic research, this was a theory that made a lot of sense from an applied perspective. So over the last couple of decades, I have refined that theory, and it has become part, even the central framework of what I do with consulting at Moranville Enterprises. The core to becoming a learning organization is establishing a culture of learning. And you have to put certain things in place, like having systems, structures in place. But what really drives those systems and structures? It's having an attitude of learning, an attitude of adaptation. You picture your experience as an entrepreneur as let's call it, in school, you may have at some point taken a special studies course where it was just you working on a project and a professor was supervising and guiding that process. Well, that's very much what the consulting process is like. The entrepreneur is working through a problem. And as a consultant, I am there guiding them through that learning process.
Did any of these ventures that you consulted, were you ever so sure that they were going to be, unicorn-bound ventures and ended up failing?
Yeah, for sure.
And no matter how much you applied the theory, did it work out? Is there any stories about that?
Yeah, so in fact, let me even give you the context for
Okay.
this. So, let's say that we have created here a venture capital firm. And we're going to start investing in startup companies. And we're smart, so we know you've got to do a lot of vetting. Right? We've got to study these startups before we start investing in them. So, after all of that vetting that we do, let's say that we invest in 10 companies. The statistics show that 5 of those companies are just going to fail outright. Even with all of the vetting that we've done, and we were sure that every one of these 10 had the potential to become a unicorn. But 5 of them are going to fail. 4 of the 10 are going to make our money back. We'll get that money back, but it's going to take a long time. Basically, they're just going to break even. So one of those companies is going to make a profit. And we are hoping that that one company that makes a profit makes a big profit. This is the one that we want to be the billion-dollar unicorn. So as you can imagine, there are lots of companies then that because when you're a VC, you put not only the numbers on the computer screen, but you kind of fall in love with this company in order to invest in it. Yeah. There are so many companies that look good that many times the final decision that the VC is making is, are they in love with this company? So every one of those 10 companies that we invested in, we're in love with. But we know that 5 of them, we only wish that we knew up front which 5 were going to fail. But we know that 5 of them are going to fail, 4 of them are going to break even.
Is there a time where it starts getting close and you start noticing certain patterns, or where you're sure these 5 are the ones that are going to fail or succeed or be more successful?
And at some point, we as a VC firm, we've got to make that tough decision. Do we continue to put money into this business because maybe they're just going through a rough patch, and if we keep putting some money in, they're going to get through this? Or do we come to the conclusion that we've got to pull the plug? And when you're in love with that company, it's a hard thing to pull the plug.
Sure. So how does a startup know they're unicorn bound? How does an individual, when do they figure it out, or when do they go seek investment? When do they find out they have that $1 billion idea?
It's a long way out the road. It really is. It's not, I mean, everybody might have, you know, that little thought in their mind that this idea that I have, it's a unicorn. But there is a big distance between the fledgling, the gazelle, and then ultimately the unicorn. And, you know, you start to get an inkling that there's a possibility, right? Maybe like you have that little 1% inkling that there's a possibility when you get to the point of being a gazelle. And as you move further down that path of becoming even a stronger gazelle with, you know, more revenue coming in, getting greater control over your costs, that's when you start to, you know, really recognize, hey, this could be something really big. You know, let me tell you about a company that I think is kind of a cool company, but it's not a high-tech company. At least not what we tend to think of as a high-tech company. Is that all right?
Yeah.
So one of the companies that's in Utah is called Purple Innovations. Have you ever heard of Purple Innovations?
I haven't.
All right, this can be some research for you.
Okay.
Purple Innovations doesn't make, you know, products like Apple does. They make mattresses. Now, you know, mattresses are pretty low tech. Agreed? Mm-hmm. So in the late 1990s, they were making a mattress that was intended for the medical market. And, you know, they dominated that market. It was the medical market, as you might imagine, for mattresses is kind of a small market. It's not a rapidly growing market. It's a mature market. And so they had dominated that market. You will think, though, over the last 10 years, there have been a lot of mattress companies that have come on the market.
Yeah, there's a ton.
Yeah. And so the two owners, they decided, you know, we have a great mattress. And while we've dominated this one medical market, what if we were to give everyone in the world the pleasure of sleeping on our mattress? See, in the medical market, the issue is that people who are bedridden, they experience compression sores. And so they had created a mattress that alleviated that kind of pressure. Well, everyone needs to have a comfortable sleep. So in, I believe it's about 2013, they start looking at how can we get into this growing general mattress market. So 2015, all of their company profits are coming from the medical mattress, none from the general. In 2016, they're now making about $100 million in sales off of general mattress sales. From 0 to 100 million.
Not bad.
It's pretty good.
2017,
Yeah.
right? They doubled again in revenue. Now look, when they're the small company that was selling to the medical market, it was easy for them to finance internally because the growth was slow. They were making, it was a cash cow, they were making lots of profit, so it was easy to grow that business internally. But when you're going from 0 sales to 100 million, and then from the 100 million to 200 million, you cannot sustain financing that kind of growth internally.
Yeah.
So they, at that point, had to reach out, and you know, they had to find financing outside of their company. And today, 2019, Purple Innovations, it is a bona fide billion-dollar valuation. It is a unicorn. And notice, right, it wasn't Apple. They weren't selling telephones. They weren't selling digital devices. They were selling mattresses.
Did they ever share, how they ended up dominating that market? Like specific things they did to dominate that market?
Well, you know, one of the things that they have done particularly well, and if you go online and, you know, you look up the advertising for Purple Innovations, you'll see some pretty cool, like, Facebook ads,
Okay.
right? I mean, they really had some very cool ads. But, in my opinion, right, in my professional opinion, it's not the marketing that brings a company competitive advantage. I bet you can guess what I'm going to tell you. It's their ability to learn.
Yeah.
It was their ability to adapt, to figure out what was going on in their market, and to communicate that throughout the organization, so that the organization, not just individuals, but the organization became a learning organization. That's where I really see that adaptive, competitive advantage comes from. It's the ultimate source of competitive advantage.
I just wanna touch on, like, if it was ever hard for these companies, you know, you being blind and them being seen, did they ever say, like, what do you know about this? Or did you ever get resistance, you know, like, and what did that look like? And how'd you deal with it?
Well, you know, this is a thoughtful question.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I would probably never really know if somebody wasn't working with me because I'm blind.
Yeah.
There is a real strong possibility that there are people that have not done business with me because of that. But they would never tell me that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the wonderful thing that I see about business, it is completely a merit system. You know, it has nothing to do really, ultimately, with who you know and, you know, who can create the opportunity for you. I tell entrepreneurs all the time, quit sitting around and waiting for the opportunity and make it happen. And that's been the philosophy that I have used. I can't sit around and think about the people who might not think that I can do the work for them. See, I'll tell you that there are two kinds of people that I'll come across that frankly, they are irritating to me. Can I say that?
Of course.
So one person will say to me, you can't do that, you're blind.
Yeah.
The second person will say to me, you can't do that, you're blind. And I know you're hearing that and you're thinking, well, they're both saying the same thing, but they're not. The first person is saying, you can't do this because you don't have the ability to do it because you're blind. The second person is saying, you can't do this. I pity you. You're blind.
Sure.
Both of them are equally irritating to me. Because I got to tell you, and my message for both of them, I am blind, and I'm coming after you. Right? My job is to destroy you.
Where does that confidence come from, and how does one attain that?
So, you know, confidence really comes from achieving goals. And you start out with a goal that is the right size for you. You don't try to take on a goal that's too small for you, that's just so obviously achievable. You don't try to take on a goal that's so big that it's going to overwhelm you. You start out with a goal that's challenging enough, and you accomplish it. And then you ratchet it up a level. You find the next goal that's a little more. Because with each of those successive goals that you are able to accomplish, you develop confidence. And you just, truly, you just start where you are. And that's the wonderful thing about confidence. You don't have to arrive at a certain point before you start developing it. You start developing it right where you are today.
That's awesome. Well, we are gonna end on that note.
Cool.
And we're gonna open it up to the audience. If you guys have any questions, now is the time.
But before we open it up, let's give them a clap, please.
Thank you.
Really excited. If you have questions, this is your 15 minutes of fame, so please, and I know you're gonna have plenty of questions. You have a question?
Yes. Got to remember what? How many of the people that you got irritated? How you came across?
How many people have you come across that have irritated you?
There are lots of people. And that's what drives me to accomplish every day. Right? Because I told you, now see, I've shared with you my mission. My mission is to destroy those people. So I have to feed on that every day.
I've got a large entourage in my class, and I know they're dying to ask. Somebody ask, because I don't get many questions in my classroom. Somebody has a question? Really? There you go. Right on, one broke, yeah.
So our professor's always telling how Fresno, well, not Fresno, but like we have to be disruptive.
Yeah.
So he's always mentioning that, and like, for example, Fresno doesn't have that mindset. We have a mindset of scarcity. So as entrepreneurs that are from Fresno, like for example, we're taking this class, we're trying to get a better insight. Basically what I'm trying to say is that how do we develop that? I mean, we are learning from obviously a professor who's known for entrepreneurship, but how do we go above and beyond that?
And tell me your name.
Aaron?
Aaron, thank you. Yeah, I understand that you have been indoctrinated into writing, right? Ride. Revolutionary, innovative, disruptive, evolutionary. Am I right?
I just shared that with him today.
Yep.
That's your whole concept.
I'm trying to get a question. What was that again? I'm sorry?
Ride. Revolutionary,
Yes,
innovation,
yes,
disruption,
yes,
and evolutionary.
yes.
We just had that talk today coming on.
Right.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Please, hang there for that. My name is JC, and I'm a professor here, and I teach entrepreneurship. And one of the things that I try to infuse into this is disruption. Any new idea is going to disrupt someone at one point or another. Okay? Any new creative idea that's not seen, hasn't been seen before, it's going to be disruptive. How do you find disruption a needed element in entrepreneurship?
Oh, absolutely. The more disruptive the idea, the greater the opportunity for competitive advantage. And that's really what every business that's going to be sustainable in the long run needs, is competitive advantage. You've got to do something better than what your alternatives are. So you want to make sure that you're disrupting whatever your existing competitors are doing. See, there are two methods of adaptation. Right? I talked about that it's all about adaptation. Well, there are two different approaches. One is, let's call it the theory of the environment. And basically the theory of the environment says that those ventures that are going to succeed, they change themselves to fit the demands of the environment. The other theory is the theory of the organization. And this says that a successful organization is one that is going to change the environment to fit the desires of that venture. So if you think about that first theory, there are a lot of examples of that. You know, small companies, that they must adapt to what's going on in the environment. They have to change themselves. But the second example is saying that this company, this one company, can change the environment. See, that's disruption, when you're changing the environment. And so, you know, in the history of business, if we go back to the 80s, Microsoft comes on the scene. They were very much disruptive. But Microsoft started losing its grip. And in the late 90s, Apple then started to come on the scene, and it was changing the dynamics of how competition took place. That's an example of disruptive competitive advantage.
Thank you. We have another question. I'll ask for them because they're just not brave enough to ask.
Oh.
Another thing I coach is failure and how to embrace it versus to run from it. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, in fact, I think that you need to face your fears. Right? When you have failed, all that means is that you tried. How can that be bad? How can it ever be bad that you've tried and, okay, so the solution that you put in place wasn't the right solution? So, do any of you ever watch Wile E. Coyote cartoons?
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about with Wile E. Coyote on the Roadrunner?
Mm-hmm.
So you ever notice that the Wile E. Coyote, in every episode, he'd have a strategy that he would put into place to catch the Roadrunner. It would always foul up, he'd fail at it, and then what did he do? Well, the thing was, he would try again, but he wouldn't ever try the same thing twice, right? Or he wouldn't do a modification on it. I want you to do what the Wile E. Coyote has not figured out. See, the Wile E. Coyote, he put one strategy into place. He learned that strategy didn't work. But does that mean that you throw out the whole strategy because it didn't work? Maybe there was just one element of that strategy that really needed to be tweaked. That's what I want you to think of when you experience failure. You know, you are a scientist. You're conducting a business experiment. Scientists never expect for their first experiment to be successful. They know that it's going to be a series of experiments where they have to refine down the exact variables that are making the difference. So you tried once. It didn't work. Well, so put your mind to work, right? The 3 C's. You've learned how to think critically, creatively, how to communicate what you think. Because that's the purpose of an undergraduate degree. That's where you are. You've learned how to learn. So use that skill to isolate the variables. Be a scientist. And as you isolate those variables, you find out what actually makes your venture a success. And that's what leads fledglings to gazelles and gazelles to unicorns.
We have another question here. Daniel.
Regarding the businesses that you choose to invest and work with, how and where do you find each other?
You know, I do a lot of searching on LinkedIn. Do you have a LinkedIn account?
Yeah.
Right. I want you to make sure that you start using that LinkedIn account to its greatest ability. That's how I met Rafi. I was looking for people who were collegiate entrepreneurs. And I found Rafi, and so I sent her an invitation. I said, it looks to me like we're both interested in startups and scale-ups. I'd be honored if you'd join my entrepreneur connections. And Rafi was kind enough to accept that invitation, and I followed up then with another email that wasn't really asking for anything. It was just introducing myself and why I had reached out to her in the first place. I told her that I really admired the work that she was doing as a collegiate entrepreneur. And I explained the kind of work that I do and just left the opportunity available to get on a call and talk. I think that that's what you should be doing. The first thing that you ought to begin doing even tonight, go on your LinkedIn profile, and I want you to polish that thing up. Because what it does, when you polish the LinkedIn profile, it forces you to think about what exactly is your goal? What's your mission? How does your business fit into that mission? Once you've got your LinkedIn profile put into shape, then start reaching out to people. You are at a perfect stage, as you know what your mission is. Start sending invitations out to people, asking them to join your list of connections. Look, here's the picture. I want you to imagine you are in a stadium, like a football stadium. You are standing on the 50-yard line at a podium. In this stadium, there are 30,000 seats. And you have the opportunity to talk to these 30,000 people. That is what your LinkedIn profile is. You have a maximum of 30,000 connections that you can make. I would not recommend that you just randomly allow people to connect with you. You have a particular person that you want to be a connection with you on LinkedIn. You want, for example, with myself, I want them to be somebody who is in the entrepreneurship ecosystem. They could be an entrepreneur, they could be an investor, they could be a service provider like a consultant. But somebody who is involved in the startup ecosystem. So right now I have about 12,500 connections. I'm on my path to getting that stadium filled with 30,000. One of the ways that I would like to do that, would you please, before this day is over, would you send me an invitation on LinkedIn? And when you send that invitation, I want you to practice best practice. So don't just click to send with the message that just automatically comes from LinkedIn. I want you to write a little statement. You tell me your name and that we had met here and what your interest is. And of course, I'm going to accept that invitation. And when I've done that, we now start a conversation with each other. That's really what LinkedIn is about. And if you're not using LinkedIn yet, make that change today, because that is the first step that you can do to really start networking on a global basis.
We have time for one more question.
And here she is.
So I got a chance to have a one-on-one with you yesterday, but I just can't get enough. So and there you guys have it. You guys need to buff up your LinkedIn profile so you guys can make a connection with Dr. Moranville. So my question to you, Dr. Moranville, is when you're in the startup phase and you happen to get that fog vision, what is your point of view on overcoming that fog when you're just at a point where you want to throw in the towel? I consider that as fog vision,
Yeah.
and I've been having that lately. So what are your suggestions on overcoming that?
That is a wonderful question, because it feeds right into one of my slogans. Right, I help entrepreneurs, right, to remove their blind spots, right? Especially those entrepreneurs who are caught in the fog of venturing. If you are caught in the fog of venturing, you should wear that like a badge, because it shows that you have invested yourself. With the research that I've done, and I've read other people's research as well, there is one distinguishing characteristic that really makes the difference between the want-to-be entrepreneur and the entrepreneur. And it is that they went past the point of no return. You know what I mean by that? See, there are a lot of people that talk about being entrepreneurs. But there's a certain point where you got to go all in. And the wannabe entrepreneur will walk right up to that point, and they'll wring their hands and they'll fret about it, but they'll never step over that line. The entrepreneur steps over that line. Now, does that mean that the entrepreneur who steps over the line, the point of no return, that they're successful? No. In fact, it's pretty much a given that anyone that is trying to be an entrepreneur is going to fail. You don't just become an entrepreneur by trying once. As I said, you're a scientist, and you keep doing the experiment. But the key is stepping over that point of no return. Because those entrepreneurs, the real entrepreneurs who have stepped over the point of no return, there's no going back. They've made the financial investment, the emotional investment. Once they've made that investment, they may not succeed their first time, they may not succeed their second time, but the possibility of that entrepreneur continuing to make successive tries increases their potential for success. That's how you get past the fog. Is first of all, you step across that line and you keep going for it. You never let your goal become overshadowed by your fear. Right? You and your fear needs to be subordinated to the goal. You see where that goal line is, and your job is to get across it, no matter how that happens. It doesn't matter how bloodied you become, how exhausted you become. Your job is to get the ball across that goal.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Maryville.
Okay? Venture with vision.